Hello and welcome to Mostly Vintage Cameras. This is a Voigtlander Vito C, which was launched in 1960 and was the base model of a range of Vito C models, which included the C, CD, CL, CLR, and in around about 1967-68 Zeiss took over the brand, and there were subsequently a CS and a CSR model, which are slightly different, slightly more square-ended camera bodies. But today we're going to look at the entry-level, base-level, basic spec camera, and we're going to take some photographs, or we're going to look at some photographs I've taken. In fact, I've run two rolls of film through this camera. One was a roll of Harman Phoenix, and owing to the rather aggressive nature of the film and the bright, strong directional light I shot it in, these photographs don't really tell us a great deal about the camera, beyond perhaps the fact it works. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the features we have here. Now it's all mechanical, so there's no batteries to put in there, and on the top plate we have a simple accessory shoe, and those manufactured up to 63, so 1960 to 63. The shoe is sort of recessed into the top plate. In the native production versions, it's just bolted directly on top. There's also a rewind crank, which has a memo holder on there. I'm not quite sure how the memo holder works. Obviously there's a tungsten balance film, a daylight balance film, and a black and white film, but I'm not quite sure what I'm meant to register these symbols up against, but I guess you find your own way of using it. Now, as I say, it is a rewind crank. You can see the arrow, the direction you turn it to rewind your film, but it's flush with the top plate. How do I do that? Well, there's a little switch here that causes the top plate, the rewind crank to pop up, and now obviously it turns freely, and when we come to remove the film later on, it just pulls all the way up. So that's the top plate. Most of the action happens on the lens just here. So focusing is on this front cell, and we have infinity all the way down to 3.5 feet. This is, or maybe just a bit less than 3.5 feet actually. And this is calibrated in feet, so I presume this was an X-built model. But there are a number of little red markers. There's a little red circle here, and a red V or arrow here, and finally a red dot here. I'm assuming these are for head and shoulder snapshot mode, small group setting, and then the little circle near infinity is going to be for views, cityscapes, landscapes, and that sort of thing. So there were three sort of pre-set focus distances you could use. There's no light meter, there's no rangefinder, you have to guess the exposure and the distance. The shutter speeds are set on this dial, and we can have a shutter speed from a giddying 250th of a second all the way down to a 30th. The shutter release is on the front here, rather unusually, and I find that's actually quite ergonomic. Now, as I say, it does have a bulb time as well, so if you press the button down, the shutter opens and it stays open until you release it again. We'll revisit that in just a few moments. Apertures is a handy little sticky out bit here, lever I suppose you'd say, and apertures range from 2.8 to f22. And if we look at the front of the camera, we can see that we have a 50mm f2.8 Lanthar lens. Now again, this is the base model in the Vito C range. The better models had the colour Scopar. We can also see on the front here it's a Pronto shutter, and once again the better models had either a Pronto LK or a Pronto SVS shutter. Some of them went up as high as 500th of a second. And just underneath the lens is a mechanical self-timer. We cock that or set it, press the button, and 10 seconds later it'll take the picture. Now, some people have said that the mechanism is a little bit flaky, a little bit weak, and using the self timers to be avoided. In my experience, as I've been putting it in and out of a bag, this has been knocked time and time again, and hasn't led to any issues. Just let that run down its course again. Now, I mentioned a bulb time a second ago, so I'm just going to put it back onto bulb. There we go. The shutter release, as I mentioned, is this odd triangular wedge shape here, but on the underside it's threaded for a cable release. It just screws in there, and away you go. If you wind on, of course. All very straightforward. On the subject of winding on winds the film on, but it also cocks the shutter. There's no separate shutter cocking device, it's all in one. One thing about having the cable release screw in here is it does somewhat impede on the flash sync socket, so if you want to use flash and cable release, that might be a bit tricky. On the base plate we have a basic socket for a tripod. Now when we load a new film, we have to tell it how many exposures are on our film. So if I set this to 24-ish, there we go. As I take the pictures, I'll just take that off bulb. That actually counts down, tells me how many photographs I've got left. Which is a very useful feature really. You don't really care how many you've taken, you want to know how many you've got left. So you see it's counted down to 22 there. Now this particular camera, when I got it, was literally falling apart. The end screw, you can see it sticking out a little bit there. This is a mismatched screw. That was missing and the top plate was flapping around. Eventually the screw on the other side fell out, and even a little L bracket and another screw fell out from inside. In addition, you can probably hear the viewfinder optic is completely loose. This is held on inside with a strip of cloth reinforced double-sided tape, and on my particular one, while I was using it, it decided to finalise its transition from being sticky tape to being dust, and it fell off and it's now all loose and nasty. So to open the camera back, you might imagine you just pull up on the rewind crank, but that's not the case with this. There are two lugs at the end, you push those together and the back pops open, and that leads us to film loading, which is very conventional. Just get that out of the way. Pop the film in here, drop the rewind crank, which is putting up a fight for some reason. Come on, there we go. I'm going to move the take-up spool around so there's a slot I can use. Doing this in a slightly exaggerated way. Now this is quite an agricultural mechanism, so you do want to take a little bit of care and be a little bit delicate with it, or you can tear the sprockets quite easily. Now, having put the film in, I am going to follow this arrow and just take up the tension in the film, which it is. So when I wind on the next two frames, that will turn, as you can see. Now you might feel that's quite a wasteful way of loading a roll of film, but I pulled out far too much leader. But it's so important to make sure your film's loaded correctly, otherwise you don't waste one or two frames, you waste all of the frames, you don't get any photographs at the end of it. So it's worth taking a little time to make sure you've loaded your camera correctly. Rewinding the film is slightly unusual in that popping the rewind crank up also disengages the sprockets. So now we can rewind. A little bit fiddly as there's not a fold out crank as you find on many other cameras. And I can feel resistance there. I'm not going to force it because I don't want to tear those sprockets, as I say. and drop the film out. There it goes. And send it off for developing. So this particular one, as I say, it was falling apart. It is falling apart, but that's this particular one. It doesn't necessarily mean all Vito Cs are in this condition. Should you buy one? Well, it does have a lot of 1960s style, and that's quite nice. They are relatively inexpensive. Possibly if you go to a retailer, they might charge, well, I have seen them for as high as £100, which I think is a little excessive, but you should certainly be able to find a working one in reasonably good condition for £50 or less. And the reality is, it was a popular camera. There are a lot of them out there, so if you want one, you can afford to shop around and find one in nice condition at a fair price. It wouldn't be my first go-to camera, if I'm perfectly honest with you. Without a light meter or a rangefinder, it is a little bit of a guesswork kind of a camera. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. And when we look at some of these photographs that were taken with XP2 rather than Phoenix, we can see some pretty decent results. Let's have a look. I hope you'll agree there that some of those photographs were perfectly reasonable photographs. It's nice to have a 50mm lens on this camera rather than if you're used to trying to find one. A more modern point and shoot camera like this, Minolta for example. This has a 35mm lens, most of them do. So this gives you a slightly nicer, slightly more cropped in perhaps I should say, angular view. But at any rate, there's not really much more to say about this. This has been the Voigtlander Vito C. Thank you for watching, I do appreciate it, and I hope this has been of use or interest to you. Do have a good day.